For joining us this evening, 6:30. Call the meeting to order. First, I'd like to do is get the attendance of everybody, and Pat, if you don't mind starting with you, just announcing who you are so we can record it.
Pat Shermullum, I'm with the Old Colony Planning Council.
Joe Coughlin, appointee of the town of Plymouth.
Pine Dubois, appointee of the Speaker of the House.
Rich Grassi, minority member of the House, I don't know.
Dave Johnston, Mass DEP, representing Secretary Beaton from EEA.
Robert Jones, Health and Human Services, representing Secretary Mary Lou Sutters.
Kevin O'Reilly from the town of Plymouth.
Sean Mullen from the town of Plymouth.
Heather Leitner, Town of Plymouth.
John Orenberger, Entergy.
Jack Priest, Massachusetts Department of Public Health.
Paul Smith, representing the good men and women who work at Pilgrim Station.
John Giuso, I'm in for Kurt Schwartz, representing MEMA.
Joe Lynch with Entergy.
Dan Wolf, appointee of the Senate President.
Thank you. It's clear to the chair that we'd have a quorum, so we'll start the business at hand. I do know that Bob Hayden is detained briefly up on the North Shore with other matters, and he will try to make it. He may be a few minutes late. I think everyone else that I expect to be here is here. We do not have the meetings yet, the minutes for last meeting yet. We will have them shortly for circumstances beyond anyone's control, so we will have them for the next meeting. The purpose of this evening's meeting primarily is to hear from Entergy, specifically Mike Toomey, John Orenberger, and Joe Lynch on the decisions that they've made regarding the siting of the next pad. And after we do that, we're going to have questions by the panel. We've allocated extra time this evening for public questions. And then Entergy and probably Mike, but maybe others, will also give us an overview of what the Yankee NRC decision looks like up in Vermont. So with that, if Joe and Mike, are you guys ready?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Toomey on behalf of Entergy. We've cut out a few of the sentences in my presentation in an effort to see if we can conclude the meeting by 8:09.
Thank you.
Appears to be on. All right. Okay, Pat O'Brien is driving this. Let's get to the meat of the slides. I think we've covered this topic with the panel before. The current pad at Pilgrim has a capacity administratively to handle 38 dry casks. Actually, you could fit 40, but you have to leave enough room to shuffle the casks on the pad and move them around, so you can put 38 there. We've got 17 on the first pad today, and we will ultimately need 61 dry cask canisters to handle all the spent fuel generated at Pilgrim. Therefore, everyone can do the math. 61 is greater than 38, so we need a second pad. We have been evaluating different locations for the second pad. There are a variety of regulatory and technical requirements that guide the process. We've got a few of them listed there. Storage capacity, potential interference with subsurface utilities, regulatory requirements both from the NRC and local permitting, geotechnical evaluations, physical and engineering design considerations, security requirements, radiological considerations, hazard considerations, and it's last but not least, the impact on the future decommissioning work that needs to be conducted at the site. Next slide. We've probably shown this map before. We had 3 locations under consideration. On this map, they're labeled west, southwest, and southeast. The west is actually let's go back to that slide. West is actually where the current Isfisi pad is located. The southwest location is also commonly referred to as the upper parking lot location. And the southeast location is adjacent to the current switch yard at the site. Next slide. After doing some of the evaluation, we eliminated the southeast location near the switch yard as a contender, and we focused on the upper parking lot. and the lower pad adjacent to the existing pad. We did extensive core bores and soil analysis, radiological dose calculations, and security assessments. Here's a few statistics about the two locations that we had narrowed it down to. The option one, which is the upper pad location, approximate 75-foot elevation above mean sea level, a little more than 700 feet from the shoreline, has a 2,500-foot haul path. That's the distance that the spent nuclear fuel has to travel in order to get to the pad, and it's about 350 feet from Rocky Hill Road. Option two, which is the existing lower pad, has a 25-foot elevation above mean sea level, approximately 200 feet from the shoreline, only about a 200-foot haul path, and it's actually within the existing security perimeter. Next slide. Some of the most important issues that we evaluated were soil liquefaction, which is the ability for the soil to remain solid in the event of seismic and other events. We did a seismic analysis, a security blast analysis, site boundary dose, an evaluation of underground interferences, and we took into consideration the haul path. There are construction issues, such as access to the site, burden on the station, asphyxia modifications. I'm reading these for those who can't see the slides if it's being shown on cable show. Site boundary dose, the security equipment, the security plan, and the security transition. Again, the site access for demolition during decommissioning and the ability for staff consolidation, because we're going to eventually narrow down to just asphyxia operations, were important. We took into consideration elevation, permitting, shorefront impacts, and regulatory risks and approvals. I will say that we had a very constructive meeting with Secretary Beaton and his staff several months ago. They shared some technical data with us that was very helpful to us in our evaluation. Next slide. Drum roll, please. After careful evaluation, Entergy will locate the asphyxia in the upper pad location. That's the 75-foot mean sea level, 700 feet from the shore. It will, importantly, there are a couple of things I want to add to this. We're not only building the pad at the upper location, the pad will be large enough to accommodate all of the spent nuclear fuel at the site. Not only the fuel that hasn't been moved yet, but also the fuel that's already on the first pad. It will have a capacity of 70 casks, and that gives us the flexibility to move casks around on the pad. We expect to initiate the permitting process in early 2019 and initiate construction of the pad by mid-2019, and fuel transfer will begin in 2020, 2021. For those of you paying attention and keeping notes, you'll note that we've got a pending transaction that we've been talking about with Holtec, and some of those dates on the milestones would transcend Entergy ownership. So I have talked to Holtec representatives, and I've got a statement here that I've been approved to make, which is that I've discussed this matter with Holtec, and Holtec intends to utilize the second asphyxia pad to store all of the spent nuclear fuel at the site, which includes the spent nuclear fuel currently located on the first asphyxia pad. Consolidating all of the spent nuclear fuel into the second asphyxia pad will facilitate the safe and efficient decommissioning of the site. And I think that's it, pending questions. I know there's a lot of interest in this outcome. I want to stress that we did a careful technical and regulatory evaluation of this issue, and we made a decision based on those factors, and we believe that's the right outcome from a business perspective, from a technical perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and I certainly believe it's consistent with community interests, and those were taken into account, but they were in the context of business, technical, and regulatory considerations that we had to take into account.
Well, Michael, thank you very much, both for the concise nature of it and getting right to the point with what everybody was waiting to hear. On a personal level, I got to thank you and your colleagues for doing just what you told us you were gonna do over the last 6 or so months. What I'd like to do is open it up for questions from the panel members, and then later on, we'll open it up to some questions from the public. So if I could start over, Jackie, do you have any question at this point? Pat?
I have one. Is the intention to move all the casts up to the 75 footers?
Yes, I think, I may not have covered that as clearly as I could have, but let me say it again. The new pad will be large enough to accommodate all of the fuel generated at the site, including the fuel that's currently sitting on the first Isfisi pad. And Holtec will be the owner, we hope, by the time this has to be done, and I've confirmed with them that it's their intention to move all of the fuel from the first pad to the second pad. And, you know, the process of the fuel being moved over the course of the next several years may actually involve some fuel coming out of the spent fuel pool, initially going to the first pad, but eventually going to the second pad. And it's my understanding that their intention is to have all of the fuel moved to the second pad within 3 years after shutdown.
Thank you.
Joseph?
And that, I assume, the analysis that you all have done had to take into account the logistical aspects of getting from the current pad, the lower elevation, to the higher elevation, how you work all that out.
That's correct. And I mentioned that there would be local permitting issues. I don't want to gloss over that. That's an important, you know, the town has permitting that we have to follow. We can't take for granted that the permits will be forthcoming, and that process will begin shortly, and we hope the town will be supportive of the
Mike,
of
has
the
there been
location.
any indication in your discussions so far with the town that there will be any significant concerns about having that Isfisi pad at that new higher elevation closer to the road than the current one is?
That was a factor that was taken into account. I think Joe can probably add some color around that. It is obviously closer to the road, but I believe we are very confident that we would meet any boundary dose requirements and be consistent with existing regulations for the town. But obviously, we've got to go through the permitting process, and if people along that road are concerned about it, they'd have an opportunity to raise those concerns.
And then your security measures would take that into account
Correct.
for that new site.
Right. We actually have reached out to the Director of Inspectional Services in the town to give him a heads up. At this point, it's very preliminary, so we don't have final drawings, but we will go through the zoning and construction permitting process, provide all the details. Consistent with the other pad, we had to provide, I think, upwards of 20 drawings, and that will be the expectation this time as well. There'll also be a security barrier that eventually will be constructed around it, so that will end up being the final configuration for long-term fuel storage and ensuring that it meets all the security regulations. That's all part of the design that's still being finalized as we speak.
Thank you.
Fine.
Good work.
Yeah, right.
Can you tell me?
I was thinking you might be satisfied with that outcome.
I'm delighted, actually, with your decision. But I take it that with the 75-foot elevation, are you going to put that on the surface, or are you considering it all, you know, a sort of earthen berm around, you know, bringing it down a little and putting it underground, or building sort of a concrete berm around it, or anything of that sort?
I'm going to let Joe jump in on this if I got it wrong, but I don't think we're going to put it subsurface. I believe it'll be similar to the pad we just built at Vermont Yankee, which is essentially a rectangular concrete pad that the concrete is sitting at surface level, and then the casks sit on top of the
This in
pad.
the sort of area, the helipad kind of location?
That's correct. It would be an on-surface pad. There certainly will be security areas around it. We haven't made a determination whether there'll be any sort of barrier around it, but that's being considered as part of the design as well.
Thanks very much.
Rich?
I think it's a great decision, too. Thank you, Mike. The question I have is, right now, the high storm, or whatever the cask is called, is not monitored other than for ambient air movement and stuff like that. Am I correct?
Well, I don't
Not
know,
electronically monitored.
I'm not sure, right, I'm not sure what you mean by monitor. We certainly monitor the casks on a periodic basis. Joe can speak to that more directly than I can. I know we have a presentation next month from Holtec on the cask. Maybe that's a question for them next month. But there is some monitoring of the cask. I don't know what electronic monitoring there is.
That's what I'm talking
But-
about.
Joe?
I don't know what the final design will be here, but we'll monitor for security. There'll be 24/7 security, no matter where it's located, including the upper elevation. So there'll likely be the construction of a security building as part of that facility. Then we monitor for temperature, as Mike said, and we monitor for radiation as well. Those are part of the tech specs associated with the whole tech design.
You monitor for radiation electronically?
It may not be electronically, it may be by
I don't think
hand.
so.
But that's a decision that would still have to be made. In Vermont, we electronically monitor the temperature, but we do the radiation measurement
In
by hand.
Vermont, is the storage pad inside the protected area?
It's inside of its own new
In this
protected
case,
area.
it's outside the protected area.
In Vermont, it was initially constructed inside of the security owner-controlled area, the protected area, and then we constructed a new security area that extended it further outside of what would have been the original one. So it's kind of a hybrid design. It started in there and ends up in its own. This would be clearly outside, and then we would construct a brand-new security protected area.
It will
We'll
be
have to
with,
check the NRC on the.
it will be in a protected area by the time
protect-
it's done.
It will be in the protected area?
It will be in a protected area. There's a
No, I'm sorry,
separate
a
protected area that's created. Once you get to the point where you only have, when you have all the spent nuclear fuel on the pad and the plant is not operating, there is a specific protected area that is designed and constructed for the asphyxie. And that will happen at Pilgrim as well.
One last question, please,
Plenty of time.
Mr. Chairman. Do you plan on having a SCADA system monitor this area for security, or a security management system? Which would be, it's a separate protected area now. You're gonna shut down the plant, you're gonna shut down the security of the plant at the end of the decommissioning, right?
Well, there is robust security at the facility today. There will be robust security around the pad. We're not going to talk about what those security components are.
I know what they are.
But,
That's
well,
okay.
I'm not in a position to talk about those publicly.
It's all right, but it's it's monitored by an electronic monitoring system, a SCADA system.
I'm not going to comment on the security
That's
at the
amazing.
site.
Okay, thank you.
David?
Thank you, no questions.
Robert?
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Kevin?
All set.
I have some housekeeping items. One is, I assume Joe and Mike or Pat, we can get a copy electronically of this presentation so we can make sure it'll be up on the website and distributed.
That's correct.
The second is if we could get a copy also, Michael, of the statement from Holtec that you were able to read, so we can have that formally in the record and in the minutes. Is there a problem with that? It'll
let me-
just make it a lot easier than
Right.
transcribing it off the video, because we've got you on video.
Right.
So if we
Okay.
can do that, that would be helpful. I'm going to defer my questions until the end.
No questions, but I just wanted to say thank you for considering the interests of the town and making your decision. Thanks.
Good.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the presentation, Mike. Some of the technical details that were done in your evaluation, the Department of Public Health will, I'm sure, be questioned about the off-site dose calculations that were performed for the new location. Will those be made available to us?
I don't know the extent to which those are public, but we can certainly work with your office and determine what we can provide to you, and we'll share whatever we can.
And I had a question about the pad, the canister to canister transfer. Is that done on the pad, or do they have to bring the canisters back into the plant to do that transfer?
It's my understanding they simply move the canisters, but John or Joe can correct me.
So then-
Yeah, there's no transfer outside. The canisters that are down in the lower pad will get moved up to the upper pad as they are right now.
So do they take the canister that's inside the concrete shield container, or they move the whole thing as a unit?
Move the whole thing as well.
They just move the whole thing. They, just like it traveled from the building to the existing pad,
Yeah.
that crawler, I'm not sure what the technical term for the large mover is, but that will simply pick up and move one at a time those canisters to the new location.
You may not have the answer to this, but my question would be, are there different inspection criterias there? It's moved and it's sat, and now you're gonna pick it up again after some time period and move it again. Is there additional inspection criteria for the canisters when they're moved to the second location?
You know, it's a very good question. I'm not aware of any, but I'll take that as an action and get back to you.
Thank you. No more questions.
Okay, thanks, Jack.
Bob?
I have no questions for Mr. Toomey.
Thank you.
John?
Just one question. Mike, with the new pad being ready, I think it was 2020 on your slide?
I think it would be ready by 2020. That assumes we get all the licensing approvals and the permitting done with the town. So that timeline presumes relatively constructive engagement along the way for the permits.
Okay, so will Pilgrim continue with the campaigns of loading the cask and putting it on the present pad up until that point, and then?
Yes.
So it'll be greater than 17?
Exactly,
That can be moved up.
exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You don't get any questions, Joe. Senator?
Just answers. My only question is the transferability of the commitment to do this to Holtec, should that happen. How does that actually, so if you commit to it, how does that commitment actually get transferred to Holtec such that we don't start all over again asking Holtec to commit?
Well, that's why I checked with Holtec before I met tonight. I mean, I'm not sure what the vehicle is to make a commitment, because we're talking about something that's going to happen after
Right, I understand
Entergy's
that.
ownership. So the only thing we can commit to for today is where we're putting the second pad, how big the second pad's going to be, and then we're coordinating with Holtec. Now, they're the company that we're working with on the existing dry fuel storage campaign anyway, so they've been involved in this process all along. At some point, I'm not sure how to address that, Senator, and it's for the same reason that the last time I was here, we have to be clear that this decision was based on our business decision, based on technical and regulatory evaluations that we did, not in exchange for anything or as part of an agreement with anyone, because we are going to be litigating with the Department of Energy, because we expect that they will pay for all of this. They will have to pay for the construction of the second pad, they will have to pay for the dry fuel storage canisters, and they will have to pay for the movement of the canisters. So I'm not sure it's in our interest, and I don't think it would be in Holtec's interest to sign an agreement, because I think the Department of Energy might argue that, well, you did that because you got X, Y, Z in return, and that wouldn't be true, but we wouldn't want to create that issue. So this is what they intend to do. It's what we're going to build a second pad up there, and it is what it is. I don't think it can be the subject of an agreement.
Mr. Chairman, could I just
Please.
follow up?
Absolutely.
I guess the concern I have then is that those of us who are going to opine on the transfer of license, to the degree that it makes any difference, it would be important to those of us who are going to opine on that, because should your intent and your commitment, which I absolutely think is sincere and I appreciate, I thank you for that, but to the degree that that's not binding once the license is transferred, we sort of start over on this issue, right?
Well, look, I hate to deflate the goodwill in the room, but it's not binding today, right? This is a matter between us and the NRC. And all I'm here to do is tell you this is what is going to happen. And it's not the issue, I don't believe it's the kind of issue that can be subject to an agreement with the town or with somebody else for the reasons that I've expressed. It's a regulatory issue. We certainly believe that putting the existing fuel at the first pad was the right decision at the time that was made, and taking into account all the considerations that I've discussed and the potential impact on decommissioning, we've made the right decision to put the second pad in its location, and that work will start. And it doesn't require any approvals to start other than permitting with the town and making sure we're within whatever our NRC regulations. So that work's going to start. And it is, Holtec's going to be here next month. If you want to ask them, I'm confident they'll give you the same commitment, no more, no less, than the commitment I'm giving you. But I'm telling you, that's what's going to happen.
Just one more follow-up.
Yep.
To what degree does the NRC have to, I mean, there are levels of either approval, acceptance of a plan, or simply a review to make sure it's in compliance with their existing regulations? Which of those three is sort of at play here?
I would describe this as we have to provide them with a radiated fuel management plan, and we will do that, and we're advising them of how we're planning to handle it. There is no formal, my understanding is there's no formal approval from the NRC about one pad location or a different pad location. And Joe can correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, I guess the only exception would be that they would approve the security plan. So we have to ensure that this is located in such a way that our brand-new physical security plan for that dry fuel storage facility meets all the regulations. So that's very, very important, and that would be a new submittal because it's outside of our current security area.
Just as a
Yeah.
final question, I promise. Is it possible then that after transfer of license, Holtec could just say, we've actually rethought this and would like to do something different? And if that sounds like it's questioning Entergy, it absolutely isn't. But I think we just we're really curious as to whether when the license is transferred, Holtec could just decide, hey, we've looked at it differently and we just want to have a different plan.
Well, the statement that I read was actually an expression of their intent,
Okay,
not our intent.
okay.
Because we're not intending to be the owner by the time this work gets done. This is an issue that we've discussed at great length in Vermont, and I don't have a better answer on this one for people who want something in writing, other than to say that, the federal government has breached its obligation repeatedly for years in failing to pick up this fuel. And as a result, we are forced to sue them for these costs. And that fact makes it very complicated to address things that you've raised, because none of us wants to create an opportunity for some lawyer from the DOJ to say, well, this wasn't really the right place to put the pad. You put the pad there because, Ms. Dubois told you should, or because Senator Wolf said you should, and that's not the, I only said Ms. Dubois because I couldn't remember if you were a senator or a representative. I'm sorry. Thanks. We're just in this quandary. And I can't solve the problem other than to say, we made a business decision, it's the right decision to make, and that's what we're going to do. And I don't think anybody should sign an agreement about that, because I think it'll undercut the recovery of the costs.
Thanks.
A couple of quick administrative, both Jackie Horgan, Representative Mr. Chapman has arrived, and Bob Hayden has arrived, to add them to the minutes. I've got a couple of very specific questions, and I don't mean to diminish I think the pleasure that everybody has with what you've said tonight. But I'm puzzled by a lot of little details in this that we'll get to. Is it correct that Entergy has already entered into a contract with Holtec to perform this work when it's done?
Entergy has, I don't know the status, we have a series of contracts with Holtec for pieces and parts of the dry fuel storage campaign. And, there's work being done today. Maybe not today, but now, in current time. And there's been work done in the past. I don't know if we have, when you say this work, do you mean we've already signed a contract with Holtec to build the second pad and put it in the upper lot? Is that your question?
Yes and no. My understanding from past presentations and the conversations has been that this will be a turnkey, that you're not gonna parcel out who's gonna put in the rebar and who's gonna pour the concrete. This is a turnkey, with Holtec taking responsibility for the entire piece, you taking those numbers and going to the federal court to be reimbursed for the costs that the federal government should have avoided having to be done years ago. So my question is there a contract in place today between Entergy and Holtec to do that job?
When you say that job, do you mean
Construction of the next pad?
for all the work? I don't know the answer to that question.
There's no contract in place right now.
Okay.
Is there a contract in place for part of it?
There's no contract in place right now.
Okay, good. So then, let me walk through the initiation process. As you pointed out, Mike, that in early 2019, you're gonna start the initiation of this. And there's a couple of interesting time things, and we, believe me, I think perhaps unanimously as a group, we do not wanna foul up either the appropriate reimbursement that should be given from the award fund at DOE, or the best location, which we, I think, would agree for what we're dealing with, that's the best location. But we're gonna have two entities here crossing paths at some point in the future. Because I assume, like most, that with Holtec's background, with your background, with your understanding of the NSC's requirements, this transfer, once it's submitted, unless there's something really egregious that nobody knows about, will probably occur. And that's great, okay. It's really good.
Well,
for-
just so the record's clear, if that was in any way construed as a question to me, I have to say on the record, we do not take for granted the NRC's review of this process. We have no idea whether they'll approve it.
Yeah.
We're certainly hopeful, and we believe we're going to submit a compelling case, but I just didn't know how that would read back on the transcript if I
That's
was
just
silent.
just my opinion.
Okay.
It's editorializing before it. But where my question gets in is, Mr. O'Neill, the last time he was here, said that he'd be real comfortable with just a handshake, because that's the way he likes to conduct business. And I really do appreciate them telling you that this is their intent. I think collectively, both as the panel, as the communities, as the Commonwealth, we'll need more than intent. We really will. We'll need to have assurances, and anybody else can ask questions, that this is what's going to happen if they become the owner of the property and the responsibility, that it's more than just, well, yeah, that's our intent. Because people's intentions sometimes change. I don't want to follow anything up. It's a subject matter for another conversation at a different time. But I got to let you know, there's lots of concerns about everything from, what are you going to sign up for you? What are you going to guarantee us? What are you going to assure everybody involved in this process, the stakeholders? Because, as I think I've mentioned in the past, my personal goal in this is to have everybody on the same page. I'd rather support this whole piece than to be fighting about it. You've made a great step, I think, tonight in your analysis, all the input you took to come up with what is, I think, personally the best spot. We should keep that momentum going and get it done. But I am very personally concerned that without, and he seemed like a good fellow, and I'd like to shake his hand, but I really wanted it in writing. That's just my thoughts. Any other comments?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so just,
Can we
Yeah,
just,
you want to,
so, you know, I pose this to Pine, after we get to our decision, what is this panel gonna do for Entergy or Holtec in going after this? So I would pose the same question back to you in writing. What's the intent? And is everybody in agreement to support us when we come to going after our permits and so forth? So I don't need an answer.
Oh, I'll give you an
I'm
answer.
just posing
Well,
the same
let me just be clear, because John's raised a good point. We're not asking for anybody to support the transaction in exchange for what I just described tonight. We did not make this decision to curry favor with anyone. We're not asking for anything in return. It would be nice to have support from the town for the permit, but we are not asking anybody to do anything in exchange for our decision. It's not an agreement. You know, the placement of the spent nuclear fuel and the compliance with the regulations under the NRC is a matter between the owner of the property and the NRC. we have an obligation to be transparent, we have an obligation to keep everybody involved in what's going on, but I just want to make sure we're not creating an expectation that there's some kind of a bilateral or multilateral agreement process here where, you know, decommissioning activity is done by, you know, 18 signatures on a piece of paper for each step of the process. And that's not how this will work. There is some activity that is only jurisdictional to the NRC, and everybody is interested in it, but there's no right to enforce, there's no ability to compel. You know, I think there is a level of good faith and trust that has to be achieved through this. I mean, the panel's an important, it's an important body. It was created by the legislature with limitations around its role, which is not to direct the decommissioning activities at the site. So I don't know how far down the road we will get with an insistence on every major decision being executed in the form of an agreement, because there are some things that are just not appropriate to be executed in the form of an agreement.
So thank you. I had a question a little bit ago, and so thank you. I think you've made it perfectly clear that this is a sort of one of those happy coincidences when your business decision is the business decision that serves your interest, and it happens that it seems like it makes all of us happy as well. That's a good thing. I was just looking for a little bit of clarity on Holtec. It seems like we're talking about Holtec in two different ways. You know, one, you're hoping to sell to Holtec, and then I heard Sean asking about a contract, and sort of I was presuming in listening to the discourse there that the contract would be for Holtec to do the work, constructing it. So theoretically, you talked about starting down the road of permitting in early 19.
Correct.
So you're still going to be the owner in early 19. So that would mean it would be Entity doing that. So Entity would start the ball rolling, and the license transfer will take whatever time it takes. And once the ball starts rolling, it sounds like you're committed to keep the ball rolling on building this. So at some point, you'll have to develop a contract with someone to do this work.
Correct.
Now is that going to happen sort of regardless of the timeline for the license transfer? So that's going to be on its own timeline. If it happens that that timeline gets interrupted with a license transfer, then hopefully Holtec will take it over. If the license transfer is delayed, then theoretically by 2020, Entergy would have finished the work with whatever contractor they're going to use. Is that about right?
Yeah, my understanding is that our timeline for construction of the asphyxie pad, and John can jump in if I'm wrong, is really independent of the license transfer application. We will be doing that work along the way, because we don't really know when or if the transaction would be approved. We have to build a second pad. We're going to be out of room on the first pad, and that's the pad location, whether it's Entergy's ownership, continued ownership, or it's Holtec coming in, or somebody else is the new owner if for some reason that transaction didn't get approved. So that work will continue. Now, we should have clarity on the ownership of this. I'm hoping we'll know whether this transaction is approved certainly by the end of next year, you know, a year from now. And you're right. Holtec's got two roles here, right? Currently, they're a vendor for us, but they've also made the business decision to become an owner and to do these kinds of decommissioning projects in other places. So in that sense, they will, if this transaction's approved, they will become the owner and be self-performing this. You know, it's in many ways, it's not different than if Entergy decided we wanted to get into the spent fuel management business, and we decided to self-perform that kind of work at our facilities. If we got the appropriate licenses from the NRC, we could do that. So they're going to step in if the transaction's approved. They will step in and be responsible to the NRC to manage the spent fuel in a way that's consistent with the NRC regulations.
And in the meantime, while that happens, you're going to move forward, and if it gets to the point where you're contracting it with Holtec or whomever before the transfer happens, that contract will be signed, you'll have it, And that's something you'd be able to tell us.
Right, on that part of it, yes. We will have a contract with Holtec. It's not that different, it's not a perfect match with what's going on in each state, but in Vermont, for example, we've signed an agreement to sell Vermont Yankee to North Star. And North Star will become the owner if that transaction's approved. Now, today, we've got a contract with North Star to perform some preliminary decommissioning work at the site. So they're a vendor of ours today. If the transaction's approved, they will become the owner and they will be self-performing after that. And they're not managing spent fuel, but they're doing other kinds of preliminary work on the site that will lead to bigger decommissioning, demolition work once we know whether the transaction's approved. Is that responsive?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Just to follow up on the cast that you mentioned, are they gonna be designed in a way so that they can be mobile in the future? If there's any future movement of these casts, or is it just?
Some might argue we've already reached that point, but I'd say you've hit the limit of my expertise. And that's probably a better question for Holtec next month when they're here.
I believe as they're designed right now, they are not mobile cask that would be approved and authorized to, say, put on a railroad car and move it as constructed. Is that correct, Joe?
No, that's not correct. The casts, the inner casts, the stainless steel casts that hold the 68 fuel assemblies are what they call intermodal. They would have to be removed from the outer concrete shielding, put into a transport cask, and then they could be shipped either by rail, boat, or a truck. That hasn't been worked out. We don't own transport casks. Holtec does, but they are designed so they don't have to be reloaded to be transported to another facility.
I misspoke. The concrete, as you look out in the pad and you see this concrete overpack shielding the steel canisters inside, that whole unit is not physically moved on a barge or a railroad car.
Correct, just due to
It's
the weight limitations.
The inside can is put into another shielded container, and then that is loaded on a transport vehicle.
That's correct.
You have another question, Joe?
Yeah, Sean, before you move on to the next topic, this is related, and although it's not on the agenda, it's related, and I think it's important. It came up at last month's meeting, and I believe it also came up at the special August meeting in response to a question about the new PSDAR that Entergy and Holtec were going to come out with. I think the statement at the time was sometime later this month or maybe early next month. And whenever that is, and if you could give us an update on that status, that's going to be a really important document that everybody's going to want to look at and see what is contained within it. Are you in a position to update us on where that is, because it's so important?
Yeah. Our current target date, and we still expect to file a number of documents at the same time. The application for a license transfer, post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, PSDAR for Holtec, PSDAR for Entergy, an irradiated fuel management plan, and there's another document that I always forget the name of.
Decommissioning cost estimate.
Correct.
In the commingled funds.
And the commingled funds exemption. All those documents we'll still plan to file together. I would say our target now is around mid-November. We're taking some extra time to work through those documents, and I think it's time well spent on the front end to try to shorten the review period on the back end by trying to address everything that people have concerns about up front.
Thank you.
And for those, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, for those of you that didn't have the opportunity to listen on the NRC's preliminary call about the application, there's a very tight time frame that occurs immediately after this. There's a 30-day, and I'm remembering it off my notes, there's a 30-day public notice period, which is followed by a 20-day comment period, which is then followed by however long the NRC decides to look at it. Is that about right?
That's about right. The important point to remember is that the 30-day period doesn't begin until they publish the documents in the Federal Register. And there's no specific timeline for that.
Yeah.
I will tell you, in Vermont, that took at least a couple of months before they filed it in the before they provided notice in the Federal Register. So we will file it, and those copies, those documents will be available in the sense that people can read them, but they won't have been officially published in the Federal Register, so the time period doesn't start right away. So I don't want people to think that the 30-day period is going to run over the holidays this year. It'll, my guess, and it's just a guess, is that this thing won't show up in the Federal Register probably until after the holidays, maybe in January, and then the periods begin to run that you just identified.
And Sean, that's specific to the license transfer application.
yeah.
The PSDR has a
Right.
separate.
Separate timetable.
That's right. I was talking about the license transfer application.
It's just for the panel, for us to be thinking about what we need to be looking at over the next 3 and 4 months. These are gonna move, by comparison, relatively rapidly, and we ought to be thinking about that. No other questions? We'll let Mike and Joe and John move on to the next topic, which is the overview of the Vermont Yankee decision.
Yeah, and I don't have a presentation for that. I think it's fairly simple. There was a lot of documents into the record in the NRC. I won't burden the panel with all that. The order that the NRC issued on October 11th was relatively brief, and in short, it approved the license transfer. There were 2 documents. There's an order approving the transfer, and then there's a safety evaluation from the staff, which has a lot of the meat in it of what their findings were. But bottom line is they found that North Star was technically qualified to be the holder of the license at Vermont Yankee, and that there was financial assurance, adequate financial assurance. Now, there were 2 items discussed in the order about financial assurance that bear pointing out. One is we had a fairly comprehensive MOU with the Vermont parties, almost all the Vermont parties. And one of the components of that is a support agreement, a $140 million support agreement from the parent company of North Star. And one of the conditions the NRC put in its order was that there couldn't be any modification of that $140 million support agreement until certain milestones were reached. And that's actually also and already in the MOU. So it's not a new requirement, but it's one that the NRC borrowed from the MOU and thought appropriate to reflect in its order. And then there was one new item, which is, I may have talked about this the last time I was here, the NRC staff has an interesting way of calculating the financial assurance for owners of nuclear facilities, and one facet of that is that they generally have been unwilling to assume that you get any money back from the DOE for spent fuel management costs. So they will recognize that you're spending money, but they won't recognize that you're recovering any money. So at some level, if you only reflect the outflow and you don't reflect the inflow, over time, you never catch up. Now, in truth, we're recovering somewhere along 85, 90%, I think was the figure for Vermont for the last 3 cases on the dollar, but those don't always get reflected. At some point, the NRC didn't reflect those recoveries at all. Their latest order seems to give a little bit of credit for that, but I give you that background so that the provision that they added was that North Star has expressed its intention to try to reach a settlement with the DOE on an ongoing basis, because once you take over a site and you only have what we call ISFISI operations, it's a pretty predictable path of costs. You have security costs, you have some maintenance costs, and they tend to be consistent year to year. North Star has expressed its intention to try to reach a settlement with DOE so that they don't have to go in and sue every 3 years for basically the same set of costs. And what the NRC said in its order approving the LTA is they're going to give North Star until 2022 to try to reach a settlement with DOE. If they don't, they'd like if if North Star is unable to reach a settlement with DOE, they want North Star to post a $4.3 million performance bond, which basically would ensure that there was some cash available in case of a default for asphyxia operations. And if they don't reach a settlement by 2024, they want them to up that to $9 million. So it's not a large amount in the grand scheme of things, certainly in the context of the transaction, but that was a new component that wasn't previously in the MOU. Since the NRC order came out, we refer to ourselves up there as the joint petitioners. The joint petitioners, Entergy and North Star, have submitted a copy of the NRC order into the record of the Vermont PUC proceeding. Mr. Scott State, the CEO of North Star, filed a brief piece of testimony just attaching the order and reflecting those commitments. We actually had a procedural order from the PUC today that suggests that they don't believe any further process is required, and that doesn't tell us when the PUC might rule, but they did indicate they're probably not going to rule by October 31st as we had hoped, but at least they think they have everything they need in front of them to make a decision. That's really the extent of the status update, unless there are questions.
Sean, were we gonna invite Bruce Watson from the NRC to come in at the beginning of the year and kind of walk us through as these submittals are done of what their
I think that's
timeline
I
is?
think that's really a very good topic to discuss, because between the working group, the state's working group, Holtec, and at least 2 or 3 other topics that I'm aware of, we've got to decide at the end of this meeting, what do we really want to focus on the agendas for November, and then January, and then February. And I hate to bring it up and be the Grinch here, but once again, we may find ourselves in a spot because of activities that are going on. We may want to schedule a meeting in earlier December because of just the events. So I'd like to defer that really, but I certainly think, I thought Mr. Lamb was particularly helpful during the teleconference in explaining some stuff, but I want to hear more from Pam and the rest at Holtec. So as we think about what do we want to hear as a group, I think it's got to start first with the state's working group, and that's got to happen in November, and it will happen in November. We will have them there, here to explain to us exactly where everything stands on that. There's so many moving pieces here that it's complicated for everybody. What we obviously don't want to do is agree with Entergy citing this current location to damage their chances before the federal court, that we're pleased with this. But I think we need to take that up at the end of the meeting after the public.
I would just like to hear that come from Mr. Watson to make sure that what's being communicated to us and
Yeah.
our understanding of that timeline is jibed with what the NRC's timeline is.
Yep. Any other questions, Kev?
Mike, on the $140 million support agreement, who were the parties to that agreement?
Well, you're testing my memory here. Let me see if I have a copy. A way I'd like to describe it is it's a parent company of North Star. North Star is not a publicly traded company, but they have a parent company. And in the course of the Vermont PUC state approval proceeding, North Star offered up a support agreement as an additional element of financial assurance, largely because of the size of the decommissioning trust fund relative to the estimate for the work. And I don't actually know off the top of my head the name, the legal name of the parent, but it's the parent of the company that is going to be taking over the site.
And that's with the PUC?
It's, the support agreement is actually, I believe, between the parent company and the sub, because it's essentially a funding agreement. So it's an agreement that this money will be made available. I don't believe that the state is a party to that agreement. It's, essentially what the PUC will do if they approve the transaction is they will maintain as an obligation of the company in front of it that you have to have this support agreement in place. And there are a number of other very technical requirements in there about financial assurance, but that, I believe that agreement, it's fair to say that agreement is between the parent and the sub, much like, you know, from time to time, Entergy Corporation has agreements between its subsidiaries. And same thing.
Any other questions? Just one housekeeping item. Shall we do the invitation to Holtec, or shall we do it through you guys for next meeting?
You can do it through me.
And to follow up on a question you had earlier, Sean, what I'm going to try to do is get, rather than have a typed-out statement from me about my understanding of their intention, I'll see if I can't get a letter from Holtec that just says this is what they intend, have them send it to you as the chairman of the NDCAP, and share it with the other parties. I think that's easily achievable.
Thank you. Hearing no other questions, we'll go to the public question period tonight, and we've allocated 25 minutes for it. With that, the usual process will apply. How many folks would like to ask questions this night? Raise your hands. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 people? Everybody will get 5 minutes, and if it runs over a little bit, we'll be fine. Why don't we start, Jim, with you tonight, since you're in the first row?
Let me just start off by saying that I was very glad to hear the decision that's been made about moving the location of the spent fuel pool, and also to admit, quite frankly, that's not what I expected the decision would be. And I think this is a positive step in a lot of ways. I think there are a couple of things that the panel has to keep in mind, and frankly, Mr. Toomey quite clearly adverted to them. The first is that this is a business decision. It's not the result of any NRC requirement. The second is that it's a decision that I would guess to a significant degree is affected by the fact that Entergy expects to recoup 85 to 90% of the costs from the federal government, which obviously in many ways makes a decision to make because they've got a hell of a long haul road that they're going to have to build. I'd then like to pick up a little on what Sean said and slightly change the subject of where is this panel going from here. Last year, you learned a lot of basics about Pilgrim and some superficial generalities on the decommissioning process, largely by listening to presentations from Entergy, Holtec, and to a certain degree by the NRC. There weren't a heck of a lot of specifics beyond the general outlines, and I don't recall much of any discussion about what some of the real problems might be as we move through decommissioning. This strikes me as the year in which it's time to get down to the substance of the issues that are those that are most important to the Commonwealth. And I think there are basically 3 of them. Cleaning up the Pilgrim site, the fact that you've got 40-plus years of spent fuel that's going to be there for a lot longer than another 40 years, and protecting Massachusetts against having potentially to pick up costs of this whole decommissioning process, and to some extent that wraps into how much are they going to get back from the federal government. According to the 2018 report that this panel submitted to the governor and legislature, your task is to advise them on issues relating to decommissioning and to receive presentations on decommissioning, and include some other things too. I'd suggest that you can't really do that if you only hear from Entergy, Holtec, and the NRC. You're beginning to get some information on a few specifics as to what Holtec and Entergy expect to do. I expect that you will see more when the PSDR comes out. I've read a few PSDRs. I would expect that a few of you too. They leave open questions. The thing that struck me was largely at the last meeting when Holtec made clear, and frankly most of the PSDRs that I've read in the past made clear, is all the utility will do is the minimum that the NRC will require. How does that relate to the issues that I believe are important to the Commonwealth? NRC procedure is quite clearly not going to require a significant extension of emergency off-site planning. That is going to disappear very, very quickly, as are all the monies that have been paid to the towns to provide emergency planning in the past, to enable them to protect their citizens. There is still a risk, but there won't be any emergency planning or money from Energy or Holtec, as I understand it. It's certainly not required by the NRC to help the towns protect the towns. And this is, I find this a little amusing that Energy and Holtec, I don't expect to pay any money to the towns for off-site, but they expect the towns to come in and help them if there's an on-site. A little bit of what might be called chutzpah. Second question, it was touched on earlier, the question of monitoring. The NRC does not require real-time monitoring and reporting of that monitoring to the towns, or frankly, to MEMA. Without real-time information, how are the towns and MEMA supposed to know if something is potentially going wrong early enough to be able to make the decisions that they need to make to protect Commonwealth citizens? And third, there's the question of money. What if the decommissioning fund proves to be insufficient? There are many of us who believe that will be the case. Obviously, Energy and Holtec have been telling us that it will not be. Fact of the matter is that Energy hasn't put a penny into that decommissioning trust fund since it bought Pilgrim from Boston Edison, and there's certainly no reason to expect that they're going to want to put any money in now. How is the Commonwealth going to protect itself against having to hold the bag? And that kind of leads me to what should you do? First off, you obviously have to continue talking to Energy and Holtec and to get all the information you can on an ongoing basis of what they are actually doing. But I think it's important to remember that Energy, Holtec, and the NRC don't come to these meetings as your, quote, friends. They're here because they have business interests they want to advance. And those interests are not the same as the Commonwealth's. It's not the Commonwealth's interest to make sure that Energy and Holtec make as much money as possible. It's not the Commonwealth's interest to see that a industry that I think everyone would admit has significant financial and technological problems is propped up. So what do? I would suggest get some experts who aren't beholden to the industry, who don't work for Holtec or Energy or the NRC, to talk to this panel. Let them tell you what the problems are with doing only the minimum that the NRC requires, and what could and should be done to minimize the risks to Plymouth and frankly everyone else who lives here.
Can you wrap it up so we distribute?
Really quickly. Obviously, 3 to 5 minutes is not going to be enough to do
Well, we're at
that.
we're at 7, but that's okay.
So where do you start? You might start off by reading the Attorney General's papers that have been filed by a whole slew of Attorney Generals looking at the problems with PSDARs. You might take another look at a lot of memoranda that you've been given, many by me and my wife. These don't express our opinions. They're replete with references to technical papers from experts who know what they're doing. And perhaps most important, as I said, get those experts to come talk to you. If you can't get an independent outside look, how are you expect to be able to give the governor and the legislature the information that they need? And nobody can take the position, oh, we can't do it. That's defeatist and it's wrong. The state can do things, but it's your job to tell them what needs to be done.
Thank you. Mary?
Mary Lampert. Obviously, we talk a lot, so obviously that is essentially what I was going to say. But I'm very happy, as everybody is, about the decision to move to a higher location. However, the location of the pad is one of the important issues with spent fuel that this group and the state group, if they meet, will also address, hopefully. One issue was brought up is monitoring. The current requirement of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is minimal, to say the least. Technologically, what they should have on each cask is monitors for real-time radiation release, and also monitoring the intake and outtake for temperature. That's a clue if things are going wrong, so mitigation can go in, and measurements for helium. Those are the three elements that must be monitored to provide the protection that we deserve and to be able to take some mitigation. The other issue, obviously, is corrosion. These are thin-walled canisters, less than a half an inch thick, I believe. They're made of stainless steel, which is subject to corrosion and cracking. Salt exacerbates, we know, cracking and corrosion of stainless steel. Once a ding or a scratch occurs on the outside, NRC documents show that it can go to a through-wall crack in 16 years. And then what? Dr. Singe, head of Holtec, says this concept, you could put him back in the spent fuel and change his clothes, is not feasible. Plus, the spent fuel pool is not going to be there anyway. What can you do? You can't weld, according to Dr. Singe, because that would introduce another corrosion point. In his mind, all you can do is what's known as the Russian doll technique, is to put the canister in and the cask in another cask, which would be a great big Band-Aid. These things can happen. So what can we do? We can't take the salt out of the air. We can't take the salt out of the water. You could put a building around the pad, which would make sense. It would deal with the corrosion issue, and as importantly, it would deal with preventing line of sight attack, which is an important consideration. Security, obviously, is an important consideration. So we have two issues then. Try to reduce the corrosion, and we know they're going to be there for a long time. A building would certainly help, and let's face it, a building around the pad is not a big deal, and you're expecting to get most of the money back anyway from DOE, from the taxpayers, and it would deal with security. Also, it would make sense, perhaps, to have an extra transport cask or so on site. So if you see you have a crack, and the only way you are going to know that there is a through-wall crack is from detecting the radiation. And so you don't want to wait for a long time to address it. It would be nice to have, like I have Band-Aids in my medicine cabinet. It would be a good idea to have on-site Band-Aids there. So these are just a few examples that I think this group can deal with. You could, and I think would be important. And talking about experts, I think it would be nice when you had Holtec here, Dr. Singe, to have at the same time, let's say, Bob Alvarez come up. He's an independent expert from DC. He had worked at DOE. And so you could have not necessarily good cop, bad cop, but you could hear questions and answers back and forth, sort of like the case method, and we'd all learn something on what then we'd want to recommend. The other big issue is money, and I will send all of you a bill that Dan Wolf and Vinnie DiMacedo wrote together, put before the legislature, assessing the licensee $25 million a year to go into the state treasurers, just so we have the money to make the pain less painful when we left holding the bag. But if they can do it for what they said they can do and make a profit, they get the money back with interest. Now, you can't talk about this for 5 or 10 years because bills are being considered and have to be filed to be heard next year. So I think these are the things that this group could be doing. You're concerned about financial assurance. There are a couple of senators, DiMacedo and O'Connor, who would be interested in being helpful on issues such as these. And then you move forward. And so in essence, that's what I have to say right now.
Thank you, Mary. Who's next?
Hi, I'm Diane Turco with Cape Down Winders, and I'm really not surprised that Entergy has decided to move the spent fuel pad up to the higher ground, because that's where it should have been in the first place, and we all know that, right? Too close to the ocean, and that's where it needs to be. And in fact, I'm kind of concerned about it even being there. I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but maybe even on the other side of the road, because right now, I'll start with that. Entergy was just again, Pilgrim was just again, as of October 8th, according to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, assessed as, again, the worst nuclear reactor in the United States in the multiple repetitive degraded cornerstone. It's still there. And so we're looking at the spent fuel pad, and what my concern is that I've actually been able to drive up past those no trespassing signs to read the deadly force signs, and if I had a good arm, I could throw a baseball and hit the top of the dry casks. And I could corroborate this with the Boston Globe reporter. That's what's up there right now. You can drive up there and see these casks. And they're out in the open and they're not protected. We can't have that again in another area too. So I'm asking the panel to really push for hardened on-site storage that's in a burn and protected, and get some security up there, because there is none now, today. You could go up right after this meeting, go up and drive on the property, past the no trespassing signs, past the broken guard gate, and look at the dry casks yourselves. That's very dangerous. They also are substandard dry casks, and what happens when Holtec, if Holtec does buy Entergy's property, Holtec makes these casks, so they're going to sell their own casks to themselves. And these casks are substandard. They're thin-walled. Europe and Japan use thick-walled dry casks. And that's what we need here. We need the best because we deserve protection. Entergy has been making profit over our safety all these years, and it's about time that we are now protected, because this stuff is going to be here for a very long time, and it will continue to threaten our families and our communities. So we're asking for hardened on-site storage that's in a burn or in a building, protected, security that is real security, that nobody can even look at these things. And right at that helipad, it's right near the street, between the ocean and the street. And also, too, we want more robust dry casks that would do the job like at Fukushima. The second thing I was going to mention, too, is the emergency plans. Entergy, as you know, has applied to reduce the off-site planning to Zippo. And this committee did a great job and recommended the 10-mile to stay in place. So this report goes to the governor. So my question is, how is the governor weighed in on this emergency planning reduction? Is he going to fight for the citizens of Massachusetts to keep it in place? Because the state of Massachusetts has a responsibility, too, to protect its citizens. So have you heard anything from Governor Baker regarding the emergency planning?
Is that a question?
Yes, that's a question, yes.
I can give you an answer on it, that for the first time since Frank Sargent's administration and Boston Edison was licensed, an administration, the governor's office, has actually gotten involved, assembled a group of the secretariat level to actually work directly on the project. That is the first time, to my knowledge, since the Frank Sargent administration, when we were all much younger people. So to answer your question specifically on the emergency zone preparedness, I know it's one of the topics. I don't have any specifics yet. As you may have heard mentioned earlier, Diane, we're gonna have the working group, at least a representative, in next month. And I hope you come back, because that'll be the time to ask the folks that are actually working on it, which pieces are you focusing on?
Okay, so the governor has not weighed in on that issue at
Not
all?
formally that I'm aware, but that's
Okay.
not to say he hasn't. I don't know.
Okay, all right. And just one other question. When Entergy files a lawsuit for the moving of the spent fuel, and they win the money from DOE, will that go into the decommissioning trust fund?
My understanding is no, it goes to the person that paid for the cost. Correct me if I'm wrong.
If they take it out of the decommissioning trust fund to move the fuel, will they replace it back into the decommissioning trust fund, or does it go into the pocket of the owner?
You guys,
No?
correct me if I'm wrong. The moving to safe storage
Okay.
is a totally separate issue
Okay.
from the decommissioning.
Okay,
The monies that it costs Entergy or Holtec, as
Right.
far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, you do, is that those funds are what could be litigated in the federal court.
okay.
Because the federal government breached their agreement to do it.
Right, I understand, yes, yes.
The decommissioning funds don't get used for that purpose. Am I incorrect here, Joe?
Well, they can be.
Planning of it?
Here's the deal. There are at least two buckets of things to think about. All the spent fuel management costs that Pilgrim has incurred up till today have just been paid out of operating expenses by Entergy. And so when we recover those costs, that money goes back to Entergy. When the plant becomes a decommissioned plant rather than an operating plant, the owner can submit what's called a commingled funds exemption and can utilize the portion of the NDT for spent fuel management costs, because spent fuel management is part of decommissioning. And that commingled funds exemption allows some money to be used for spent fuel management.
But
So they can
that's-
use that.
Make sure I understand. That's separate from the construction of the new pad and all that location.
No.
It's all part of the same.
Well, it depends. I mean, in this case, we're going to be building the pad while, some of the work related to building the pad will be done while the plant is operating. But the work that, if there's continued work after the plant shuts down and after the PSDAR's been submitted, if a commingled funds exemption is requested and approved, then the NDT, a portion of the NDT can be used for spent fuel management, which includes the construction of the pad.
That's helpful to me.
Right.
Diane, ask away.
What happened in Vermont with the, with the decommissioning trust fund and the spent fuel management? And the DOE?
We did not receive a commingled funds exemption in Vermont. And it had to do with the size of the trust fund. So we actually Entergy set up a separate line of credit to fund the construction of the second, well, it wasn't really the second, but yeah, it was the second pad. And we used that line of credit to pay for the costs, and then when we recover the money from the DOE, we'll pay off the line of credit. But that is not the only way to do it. If you have a commingled funds exemption approved, then you can use the decommissioning trust fund.
Very helpful.
Okay.
You yielding some of your time, Diane?
What I understood in the settlement agreement with Vermont, that there was an agreement that monies received back from DOE would go back in the future, would refurbish what was taken out of the DTF for the spent fuel management costs. Is that incorrect?
It's close. We had an agreement in 2013. We had an agreement in 2013 that if we used the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund for spent fuel management costs after shutdown, then recovered money from the DOE, we would dedicate that money to the Vermont Yankee decommissioning. We did not say it would go back into the trust fund. We just said it would be it would be earmarked for the Vermont Yankee decommissioning project. However, that was an agreement that said if we use the NDT for spent fuel management costs, we didn't do that. We between 2013 and by the time we got ready to do the work, we did not get I don't even remember if we filed for a commingled funds exemption, so we decided to establish a line of credit instead. So that agreement effectively ended up not being implemented. That portion of the agreement did not get implemented because we never used the money in the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund for that purpose. But that does not mean that we couldn't have gotten a commingled funds exemption, and it certainly doesn't mean that that practice can't be different at other sites.
So why would it be in Massachusetts' interest to support a commingled fund?
Well, I don't know what Massachusetts' interests are in this case. I mean, in order to get the commingled funds exemption, you have to demonstrate that there is adequate funding in the NDT to do all the license termination work and still manage spent fuel management, manage spent nuclear fuel. So I don't know what position Massachusetts would take on that unless they wanted to try to make a showing that there wasn't adequate funds or something else. But that's certainly within the prerogative of Massachusetts to decide what to do. Let's just assume Holtec's going to file a commingled funds exemption. The Commonwealth will have to decide whether they're going to take any action in response to that.
Thank you,
It's an standard industry practice, and commingled funds exemption are granted by the NRC pretty regularly at decommissioning sites around the country. It's a standard practice to use that part of the trust fund for spent fuel management.
So, Sean, my concern would be why, if Massachusetts supported a commingled trust fund, that money could be taken out of the existing trust fund to pay for the costs of managing spent fuel. So if we didn't support that and Holtec or whatever entity owns the plant had to set up a separate fund, let them try to recover the costs from the DOE and not touch the money that's in the trust fund.
I think that makes sense, but let me go back to something, Jack. Correct me if I'm wrong, you guys, but you mentioned that you can do the applications for license transfer of the two PSDARs, the fuel management, the cost, and then a commingled request. Did I hear correctly that you're planning that request at the same time in mid to late November? So you're planning to make a commingled funds request now?
It would be from Holtec, yes.
It'll be from Holtec, who at this point, do they have any legal standing in this at all?
Well, it'd become effective if they become the owner.
Okay. This will be a subject of some further discussion.
Is that submittal to the NRC subject to public comment period?
No. It's not part of a public hearing process. Exemptions don't typically get a NRC public hearing or comment period, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay. Do we have one more person of the public? Rich, you're up. You'll be the last one for this evening.
Two brief questions tonight, and I'll make sure everyone gets home before next Monday's Patriot game. Sean, I think last week or the week before, I circulated a NRC announcement, I think it was Oyster Creek, regarding approval of shrinkage of the 10-mile EPZ down to near the plant, immediate plant proper, based on the status of the plant shutdown and spent fuel and so forth and so on. And there was an interesting, and I circulated this to you and several others on the panel, and there was an interesting statement made by NRC, but not surprising, to the effect that the state and local municipalities essentially could take over the responsibility of maintaining the 10-mile EPZ if they basically wanted to pay for that, but it wasn't necessary for the licensee to do that. And the reason why I bring this up, and Jim's comment sort of jogged my mind on this, but I think something you mentioned earlier about the NRC showing interest in wanting to ensure that it was $140 million of the MOU for Vermont Yankee between the licensee, North Star, and the impacted communities per MOU would stay intact. I find it kind of inconsistent and perhaps incongruous that the NRC, for one situation, is throwing out the state and local municipality in New Jersey, for example, to deal with this, but yet we see in Vermont a different situation. I can only hope that our state interagency working group can develop a strong enough MOU to perhaps try to ensure that if it's not 10-mile EPZ distance, if it's 8 miles, whatever it ends up being, that the panel feels it should be, that gets funded accordingly through an appropriate negotiated MOU. The second,
If I could,
Sure.
just if maybe I can clear something up. The $140 million support agreement had nothing to do with communities, townships, or anything. It was it's a funding agreement between if the transaction's approved, between the new owner and its parent company that ensures that the owner, North Star, would have sufficient funding to complete decommissioning in the event there wasn't enough money in the decommissioning trust fund. So it's purely a financial assurance question about the new owner and its relationship with its parent company. And I just wanted to be clear in case there was any confusion about that. It didn't have anything to do with funding communities. It didn't have anything to do with EPZs. It didn't have anything to do with towns or anything like that. And I know you were comparing them. I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that those two things had nothing to do with one another.
All right, thanks for the clarification, but my comment, end of comment regarding our IAG being able to negotiate a suitable MOU, assuming this NRC's position will be the same for Pilgrim as that we've seen for other shut-down nuclear plants regarding shrinkage of EPZ. And my second comment has to do with the citing and construction of the second pad, which I know everybody here is in favor of, including myself. And I just want to bring up a little quick history, and Heather, you can straighten me out if my memory is a little bit unintact here. But several years ago, before the new pad was constructed, there was a citizen lawsuit in Plymouth that was supported by legal counsel regarding the siting and construction of the current pad. And it went to land court. Time is money. And there was, I believe, some settlement, or the adjudicatory law judge basically, I think, said the plaintiffs didn't have standing, the pad can be built, but you know, as I said, time is money. And I'm just wondering, maybe Entergy can answer this question. In terms of the decision for the first pad, is there anything held over that would also apply to this new pad so that there wouldn't be any undue delay other than any other local permitting that needs to be done for the construction, siting and construction of the new pad, that so if a lawsuit comes up, a similar lawsuit were to come up again from citizens or other entities there, that we wouldn't see the same kind of potential delay.
I'm not aware of anything that's a holdover from the first case. You know, I don't know what the motives were for the people in the first case, but I think that there was an understanding that we needed to build a first pad because we had to offload the fuel. And if we didn't have a first pad, we might not be able to operate. I'm not saying that that's what was motivating people to challenge the permit.
Excuse me, Mike, not to interrupt, I just remembered, I think the motive was loss of property value. I think that was the impetus there.
In this case, if there's an objection to the second pad, then it will just prolong the duration of spent fuel being in the spent fuel pool. So whatever achievement that represents, people will have to decide whether that's a victory.
Any final comments, Richard?
No, that was it.
Thank you. Before I entertain a motion to adjourn for this evening, Was there another question?
Not on this, but on, before you adjourn.
No, before I even entertain one.
Yes.
I have a question too.
I think there's a bunch. Why don't we start with Pine?
Mr. Chairman, can I be excused? Is there a
Yes,
question
you
for
may.
me?
No.
Okay.
sure.
Oh,
Thank you
I
very much.
have a question for you, though.
Okay.
So you said that Entergy opened the line of credit to manage spent fuel management, but didn't get the the commingling fund exemption.
I don't believe we filed a commingled funds exemption request, but I can't recall whether we did and withdrew it or whether we didn't file it. But the bottom line is we decided that the more appropriate way to handle those costs was to establish a line of credit of about $143 million was my recollection, and that the money would be drawn down on the line of credit to fund the construction and the movement of the spent fuel. And we would spend $143 million. We would sue the Department of Energy for $143 million, hopefully recover $143 million, and then pay off the line of credit, with that whole process taking, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. But that was how we handled it in Vermont. That is not, I would say, typical of how these kinds of things are handled. I think it's more typical that the licensee gets a commingled funds exemption and uses a portion of the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund to pay for spent fuel management.
Did you go that route because that was part of the MOU with Vermont Yankee, or was that any
No,
part of the?
in evaluating the commingled funds exemption, you have to look at how much money's in the fund, whether you can demonstrate that there's enough money to do license termination work and spent fuel management. It's not confidential information to know that the amount in the trust fund in Vermont was significantly less than the amount at Pilgrim. It was only, at this time, around $625 million or so when we were making that decision, as compared to the almost 1.1 billion in the Pilgrim Trust Fund. So each calculation is going to be different from site to site. In some plants, you might be able to make that showing, and in some plants, you might not be able to make that showing.
Any other questions of Mike before we excuse him for the evening?
I did have one that I thought of. You said the Hall Road would be 2,500 feet.
Correct.
Is that like a zigzag or something like that to get you up to that? Or do you
have the
know that
expert.
route in order to be able to?
Mr.
discuss
Orenberger can answer that question in excruciating detail.
that?
Yes.
Wonderful.
And I
You-
think I
you don't
covered
have to-
that in one of the presentations. We'll come out of the reactor building going west. We'll head north, go outside the protected area, onto the current, there's a current road
Yep,
that
I
we'll
know
be
there is.
utilizing.
Yep.
It'll be the former shorefront area. We'll enter that area from the site and go up around, sort of in a loop that heads south, and then onto the pad going west.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
And I
going
can-
onto the pad going east. I apologize.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sort of like an approach into Logan.
That's it.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Mike? Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.
I'll be in the audience, but just sit at the table.
Don't make any offers you don't want to keep. Couple of housekeeping items. First is, the intention at this point is to have both the interagency work group represented here next month and Holtec. Are there any other thoughts on that? Yes, Joe.
Depending upon what they tell us is their plan of operation, if you will, and how they intend to liaison with the panel, I think once we get that sense, then the panel needs to discuss, all right, what's our plan for the rest of the year, as you were alluding to earlier. But I think we've got to get that input from them first, because we don't have a clue as to how they're going to operate and what they're going to focus on. And even though they're an internal Commonwealth entity, we're a legislatively created entity, and we still have our duties under the legislation to perform accordingly. Once we get to that point, after we hear from them, and start to discuss what's our plan going to be, I think we need to discuss it in as broad a context as possible, including our work groups, population of our work groups, so forth and so on. Do we want to continue the same thing? Do we want to make any changes? So that, and again, addressing a little bit of what you mentioned earlier, as best we can avoid the crunch we got into late spring and early summer last year, trying to get our report together, which was understandable for the first year. Confusing the issue this year is all of the kinds of things that you had mentioned earlier that are going on or will be going on. All of the documents being filed by Entergy and Holtec, the NRC's advance notice of proposed rulemaking on their changes. There's going to be so much going on in the next couple of months that we've got to try and work all that into our plan so that, again, we don't get crunched at the last minute. We've got to allow time for what are our, to use the same term, observations and recommendations going to be. We got to vet them for the panel, make our decisions as to which ones you want to go forward with. But also, in addition to that, once we find out from the Commonwealth's interagency work group what it is they're going to do, I think the question was raised earlier is also very important, that the panel made its report at the end of the first year. There were lots of recommendations in it. We know some of the things that the Commonwealth has decided to adopt, but it seems like there's a lot of them there that we have no clue as to what the decision was on the part of the Commonwealth. Once we can get to that point, then I think we also need to look at, do we want to then take some of those that maybe the Commonwealth either is not going to adopt or agree with, or is just not going to address, and keep them on the table for this second year for consideration at the end of the year? Do we want to put them in again, whether they've been rejected or whether they've just not been addressed? Because there was a lot of work that went into those recommendations, and we really haven't heard much on a lot of them. And so I think that's a very important additional starting point to help us put together the plan for how we want to proceed for the rest of the year.
Well, let me comment on it, Joe, because totally in general, I agree with you entirely. I think there's a couple of things, and I'll just throw this out for anybody's comment or suggestion. I believe our next meeting is scheduled for November 21st.
28th?
Pardon me?
28th?
Yeah, I think it's 28th.
I gotta double check with.
Yeah, I have 28th down.
We're all on the time.
Thanksgiving.
I think it's before Thanksgiving. Is it the third Wednesday?
No, we have a Thanksgiving issue so it
Was it moved?
bounced us.
Yeah, well, we have,
That's why we do it
21st
right
is the
now.
day
Yeah.
before
Yeah,
Thanksgiving.
that's right. So,
Yeah.
all right, so,
Have it on for the 19th.
I think you're right.
The 21st is the night before
yeah,
Thanksgiving.
that was the problem.
28th is
that
the
doesn't work.
following.
So we also have a logistic issue finding this room again, so let me just make a note of that, because I think she may have put it on the third of each, right, verify room. That being said, then you're really getting bounced in from the 28th, because, Joe, I think you're absolutely right. What I see coming, I think Mike was probably very accurate with this, that there's at least 6 major documents, aside from what the NRC is gonna do. There are at least 6 major documents that are gonna be filed at the end of November, that period of time. We haven't had the blessing yet of hearing from the state and the interagency work group what they're really gonna focus on. It feels to me like, and this is subject to us as a group deciding, that we should focus on, for the 28th, the meeting on the 28th, the interagency work group and Holtec, to start getting some visibility. And I think we ought to reconvene, unfortunately, in December, so we'd have to vote to do that because we had previously voted not to both figure out what did we hear from the interagency work group, because we can't do this in small groups. Senator, you have a thought? Please, jump in.
I'm sorry, I do this at these meetings too often, and I hate to be the skunk of the garden party. The interagency working group exists because we asked it to exist. I do not understand why we are then waiting to hear from them. We need to be directive with them. It is my understanding and intent that they will serve at our pleasure, not by statute, but by us asking them. They have the resources to get experts. I totally agree with what we're hearing. We need experts to actually weigh in to the defense or certainly the advocacy of the citizens of the Commonwealth. So just to be really clear, it was my intent that we not duplicate the work of a group that we actually asked to be set up, that we use that group as a tool that will have the resources to do what we ask it to do. That is a fundamentally different thing than what I'm hearing right now. So I don't think that the next thing is to hear from the interagency working group. I think the thing is to have the interagency working group come here so that we can be directive as to exactly what it's going to do and what resources and experts it needs to engage to do it. Because otherwise, we're going to sort of cast them out to do some work and have them report back to us, and we're going to be trying to do our own work. And I don't really understand the process, Mr. Chairman.
I don't think it's been clear from the state side from the beginning when they finally agreed to do it, what the process is. The intent at this point is to lay out their coming into us exactly for the purpose which you said, that it's a dialogue. So the questions I would imagine from the panel are, what have you guys been up to so far? What are you doing? Here's what we want done. Here's what the panel has recommended, and that it's a dialogue opening up at the beginning.
I would suggest that we be prepared to be directive.
Oh, yeah.
So that if they don't intend to do what we ask them to do, we'll know that. And I would suggest that we ask what resources they will bring to bear and what experts they're going to use, that we hear from the public so that we get good input as to how we use and direct that group. But as far as I'm concerned, until someone tells me otherwise, that group doesn't serve exactly at our pleasure, but that group is something that we created to give us more horsepower to get the work done that we need to get done on behalf of the citizens of the Commonwealth. And because it is in the executive branch, there's accountability through an elected official, which we don't currently have here. So that there are a lot of reasons why how that working group actually gets established and moves forward is really important to this group. And I think we need to have that discussion sooner rather than later.
I think the time for the beginning of it is right now. Anybody want to comment on the senator's thoughts on this?
Well, I just think that there has been some meeting of this working group. I don't know who's on it or anything about it, so I'd love to catch up to, what they have been doing, because I think there has been some interaction with Entergy. Maybe Entergy can speak to it, with some of the people in the executive branch under the guise of getting this working group going. But, so I need to be caught up on what has transpired, and then I do agree with what you're saying in terms of the intent of this setup.
And Mr. Chairman, we have framed that through our subcommittees. I mean, we already have said, here's what we want to be looked at. So we've given them a frame. I would love for them to react pretty early as to what our one-year report said and how they intend to move forward with that as a frame, and then build in, both from getting public comment and comment from this group, additional work and additional resources to be put to task. That's because otherwise it seems to me like we've sort of created a group over there doing something that's going to report to us, and now we're going to be trying to do something else.
Any other comments on this?
The one thing that dramatically that has changed is this whole relationship with Holtec, though. And
Right.
that wasn't there when our report was written. So I think, there's a reason why it's so confusing, but this is the opportunity, I think you're right, to have them in.
Any other comments?
I don't know who it would be, however.
Maybe it would be helpful, Sean, because of the confusion and uncertainty of where the other group is. We haven't really heard anything from them so far. And wanting to try and work together and not at odds together, maybe it would be helpful if you could explore the opportunity, if that's appropriate, to get a representative from that group through the governor's office, what have you, to come and talk to us.
They will be here next
And
month.
see if we can work together. I mean, my understanding was that one of our members had been working on something with, well, something related to what we want to get done, and was taken off of the work that he was working on a month or two ago, because of actions behind the scenes by that group. And with no discussion, at least no open discussion here.
Yeah.
And I am concerned about that.
Let me speak to that.
All right, Jack.
So I'm a member of the interagency working group. We're working together to ensure that we're aligned, and I wasn't taken off the group. What the interagency asked us to do is to make sure we're aligned as an interstate agency as we work through some of the issues that I was previously working through with the Department of Public Health and the Department of Environmental Protection. So that work has not stopped. We're continuing to work with Entergy and Holtec, and we're doing it through the auspices of the working group.
Jack, would it be helpful in that regard, since you may be the only one who's worked with those folks from this group, that because of uncertainty that exists, I know on my part, on Senator's part, and probably a lot of others, if maybe we could get some representatives of that side to come and sit down with us so we can have some general discussions, so we can get to meet each other, and any concerns that there might be, we can get rid of those concerns and get a more comfortable feeling between us so we can work together and not necessarily against each other, so we can get a lot more done and probably in a more expeditious way. I think that would be helpful. The more you can typically see somebody and break a little bread with them, usually you get a better comfort level to then start negotiating whatever you want to negotiate.
I hear that concerns that are expressed by you and from Senator Wolf, and I think we'll have an opportunity next month when the working group representative participates with us to, communicate those concerns with them and work towards addressing your concerns about us having familiarity with one another and making sure we're working towards a common goal.
And let me just say that I've been working on this over the last month or so, because there's a lot of frustration not only among the panel members, that we don't even know who all the working group members are, but among the public. And occasionally I do get asked questions about this, and I don't like not to at least have some idea. I can act stupid on my own without really being. So I can tell you that it is my expectation, Joe, that next month we will begin this in-depth dialogue, much to your idea, Senator, of everybody. Let's lay it up on the table. Here's what we wanted to get done. What are you guys doing? What are you guys doing that we don't know about? Who's doing it? When are they doing it? The only downside I see to it, and Mike, where's Mike now? There you go, back there, is that if Mike was in the spot, he would never allow this to happen. We're gonna have to do this in public and show our hand as to what we really want to do and talk about that with the state and what we want to focus on. Unfortunately, that's the open meeting law, and that's the way you got to do it. But I think this time next month, whenever we have the meeting, we'll all feel a lot better about it. And if anything develops over the next, and I can say within a week or so, when you say, David, we'll have a sense within a week or so of.
Well, I'm not on the working group.
No, I understand that.
So I can't speak to everything, but I know that we are planning to get together and talk about a couple of things
So,
directionally, like we're
yeah.
discussing
Yeah,
today.
exactly. So if anything changes within the next week or so, I'll write you all and let you know. Pat?
I won't be able to make the next meeting. I have my board meeting the same night. But I'd like to make a suggestion, maybe that we have somebody from that working group, whether it's Jack or somebody else, that would be here every month to give us at least a 5-10 minute
liaison.
update on everything that's been going on.
And also, I can guarantee you that it'll come up in the discussion that representatives from our group have the option to be involved on their side as well, so that we're all on one page.
Mr. Chairman, just real quick.
Yeah.
When this was structured, we put representatives from the relevant agencies, MEMA, DPU, DPH, Consumer Protection. One of the reasons the structure of the board was like this was to exactly facilitate what we're talking about. So even though the individual people who represent those agencies may not be on the working group as people, their agencies are. I mean, I don't know what the makeup is, but I would imagine all of the agencies that are represented here have members on the working group. And that's not by coincidence, that's by design. So,
Told them.
so Jack, I mean, you or I think Kurt was gonna be on the working group. I don't know whether he is or not, or who from MEMA
My
is. but-
understanding is John's been designated.
Oh, you're on, okay, great. All right, so, I mean, it just seems like it's evolving in a good direction, so.
It is, we just need to get it going. Hearing none, then what about the December meeting? Does anybody want to make a motion to have a meeting in December? Lack of hearing a motion will probably
I mean, in November?
indicate.
We are meeting on the 28th?
The 28th
That's
is the next
November.
meeting.
That's, but we are definitely doing that.
We're definitely doing the 28th, and I'll let you know, I think that Kathy, who coordinates the scheduling of the facilities here, I think she just did every third Wednesday, with the exception of December and August.
If we do, Sean, consider December, I would simply offer that we try and hold it in the first part of the month, because after the middle of the month, it gets too
I wrote down-
complicated
I
with the
wrote down the
holidays and so
12th.
forth.
The 12th. I make a motion that we have it on the 12th.
Second?
Second.
What's the
All in
12th?
favor?
It's Wednesday.
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna see if we can get the room for the 12th of December. Expect a lot more emails. I will, seeing it's now past time, I will, yes, did you have it?
I had something before you adjourn.
Okay.
Because we just had a work group meeting tonight, that is site restoration and cleanup work group meeting. We also were hoping that on a soon agenda, we could discuss the work groups again, much to how
Yeah.
Joe was saying, and that we get a clear,
we wanna
message
go.
about what we're supposed to focus on. Or reconvene those groups, so that, we're not just
Yeah,
wheeling in the dark.
I personally agree completely with that. The problem is amount of time.
Right.
We're adding on an additional meeting that we weren't. We are going, I can just tell you for certainty, we are going to have a lot of information materials to deal with over the next 12 weeks. It's gonna be a lot.
Along with what Pine said, a similar consideration as to whether, I mentioned earlier, we have the same 5 work groups. Also, whether there's any desire to change chairs of the work groups, whether there's any desire for some of the members of the work groups to move to other work groups. And only reason I say that is because of concerns that were expressed in our first year about maybe limited or lack of experience to come up with certain recommendations and so forth and so on. All right, a fair concern. One of the ways you can address that is by people moving to, I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm just saying one of the ways those kinds of things can be addressed is the additional experience and education people will get by then going to another work group. I'm not proposing it, I'm just simply saying that I think it ought to be discussed, because that would start to address concerns raised about lack of expertise. You get expertise by moving around and getting exposed to some of the other things.
My only thought on that, Joe, before I do ask for a motion to adjourn, is when do we get to it? I mean, ideally, because I think there's been a sense among many of us for the entire year that we can improve this work group process. We can do stuff. Everybody sort of agreed to participate. The question is, against these blocks of time that we have approaching, when do we do it? I mean, I personally think the biggest priority for us right now is to get all over the interagency work group. That's my personal. The second is to understand more what Holtec's intentions truly are. I hear the intentions, I want to hear it. I think we got to do that. And then we've got a number of housekeeping items like this that we just need time to talk together.
Right.
So, put it on the agenda for January, well, we can put it on, but I would say to you, my own take on trying to organize this thing is that maybe we have to make 3-hour meetings, for January, February, and March to get this stuff straightened out.
Yeah, I share your concerns, and I don't want to see us get in the type of crunch we got into last year. But again, understandable for the first year of any new organization. But to the extent we can plan in advance to avoid that kind of a crunch, it may mean, as you're saying, we may need to have more meetings so that we can progress faster on all of the things that are going to be going on very close to each other.
I would only, before this, I would just suggest one thing to everybody. I see nothing in the legislation that prohibits us from providing our advice and guidance on periodic basis as well. That if some topic comes up, there is nothing preventing one of you from making a motion that the panel considers that says, we are properly advising the governor and the House Committee and Senate Committee on it now. This is what we think because of the immediacy of the problem. In that way, we might be able to not do the big piece at the end. The annual report could be 3 pages long. It's what we need to do at the times we need to do it. So
I agree.
I'll leave that out there to you before I entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Sure.